Well, it's interesting. I mean, you often hear how the Cardiff grammar is better than the so-called Sydney grammar, but not the other way around. It is interesting, if these are sort of meta-linguistic dialects, and indeed, I mean, people have talked about them in these terms. You could also explore them as sort of meta-linguistic registers or meta-registers, meaning they do somewhat different things. So if you look at the range of applications that people have used these different, whatever we call them, models for, I think that there's significant differences. Similarities too, of course. It seems to me that, it's interesting. I could spend a lot of time sort of dialoguing about, similarities and differences, and it's important to understand them, and also, then sort of saying where, where one is better, whatever. And I think that's important. I also have had the sense that, I've had some discussions with Robin Fawcett. I think he would like to have more dialogue, and I acknowledge this. But at the same time, I also felt that it's very important to try to dialogue with other folks. And I, of course, not successfully. I tried to, dialogue with sort of West Coast functionalists, for instance. I can't say that that's been a success. To some extent with computational and so on and so forth. So how many dialogue interfaces is it possible to maintain? And if you look outside elsewhere, I think there are often, to me, a lot of value in looking outside of SFL for ideas. Not only saying if I represent the sort of what would be called the Sydney grammar, not only Cardiff, but also other. And I could give very specific examples. I think it's important to look at what people have done in construction grammar, for example, and relate that to the sort of notion of the continuum between grammar and lexis. And I think there's payoff. There is a need to do that. There's payoff. There's important dialogue there. And if I have to choose time spent on that versus dialoguing with Cardiff, one has to choose. And I think there are lots of examples of this kind, right? Now, to me, a sort of key difference, in a sense, is, in Michael Halliday's conception, if I can use a sort of him as a summary of it, it's turtles all the way, meaning it's dimensions all the way. So I find this very appealing. The relational dimensional thinking. And I contrast that with the modular thinking that has been prominent in many different linguistic models of theories since the 50s, really. You just posit another module, and then you have some kind of relations between them. I think the great power of the relational dimensional thinking is that you have to work out how everything is placed in relation to everything else. And if you posit something, then you have to be clear about how does it relate to other things. And it seems to me that that's a very productive, and it's a way of testing, working things out, testing. Now, if I look at the Cardiff model, it seems to me that's much more like the sort of modular thinking that I've come to, that I'm familiar with from various generative approaches and so on. And so I'd say, how do things relate to one another, and what does it mean to postulate a new model? So I do think the value in this, dimensional relational thinking, and also it seems to me in a sense, the holistic thinking that is so prominent in, what Michael Halliday's done, really trying to take in language in the round, as it were, language in context, and now other semiotic systems, but then relating this to systems of other kinds. So sort of he introduced this, and he and I worked with it, this sort of order typology of systems that it seems to me is very valuable, where you sort of say, well, if you move in and you have an account of language, what does it mean? Well, it means sort of trying to theorize language as a higher order, fourth order system, semiotic system. But then that sort of follows a whole research paradigm saying, well, what does it inherit by virtue of also being a social system? I mean, as a semiotic system, also being biological, also physical, and so on. And that seems to me a very productive kind of long-term research paradigm, and one that is a sort of invitation to transdisciplinarity and so on. So I find that very attractive. And also the sort of deep functionalism of it. You know, it's a sort of deep functional meaning orientation. And it seems to me that, you know, if you posit something, it's probably the most common areas are sort of in the lexicogrammar. If you posit something in the lexigrammatical description, it seems to me it's what distinguishes, in principle, systemic functional linguistics from many other traditions is that the description is also part of the explanation. As well, you produce a description that will allow you to explain it. And it seems to me, I talked before about the changing sort of intellectual academic context. And if you look at things that Michael has been, you know, working on, often, you know, introducing first in the 60s, there are so many things where in the 60s it was just plain weird, really weird, right? Now, 50 years later, he's not as weird, meaning there is much more resonance with things that seem absurd. Take simple things like the continuity between grammar and lexis. Nobody would have thought of that in the 60s except Michael, right? And the notion that follow with this, like the exploration through the corpus, the value of corpus, probability, right? One thing after another. And even, you know, I think people now are there's much more consensus about, if again you stay with the grammar as a sort of natural or transparent or whatever we characterize in terms of meaning, and in fact different kinds of meaning, right? And it seems to me that, to me at least, shines through more clearly in Michael Halliday's work than in the work associated with the Cardiff grammar. And so, yes, it has to be sort of descriptively comprehensive, and that's been, you know, a goal for lots of systemic functional work. And Robin and his team, of course, have done extraordinary work to expand the description and so on. But at the same time, it has to be also, as it were, explanatory in nature. I think one area where, you know, I mean, it seems to me, but you know, this would really be a dialogue with somebody who can represent the Cardiff grammar. But you asked me this question. I've heard so many times why the Cardiff grammar is better. It seems to me you take a number of key points, and you know, Michael's account is much weirder. Robin's account, if you take a person, is much closer to what the tradition in some sense. And you could take a number of areas. Say, take for example what you do with hypotaxis versus embedding. Now, it seems to me Robin's is very much the sort of tradition of you know, embedding complement clauses and so on. Michael has this weird notion that you know, you differentiate between downranking, embedding, and hypotaxis. But if you see what, and another area then also relating to this, you know, embedding of clauses versus you know, complexing in the verbal group. Now, I think it's interesting things to look at. Now, if you sort of explore what people have, as it were, unearthed, particularly all the work on grammaticalization, it seems to me there is so much that can be interpreted in sort of Hallidayan terms. The sort of move from a clause complex, verbal group complex, to a verbal group. These kinds of clients that one can see in his work that resonate with the sort of growing evidence from grammaticalization. So that's part of what I'm saying, that the description has to be sort of, in a sense, have a built-in, at least, potential for explanation. And that to me is very significant. And then you take the sort of range of applications. To me, the work on language development by, Michael Halliday, Claire Painter, Jane Torr, and others, Bev Derianka, later phase, and so on, is so important. And the ability to say this is the sort of what we describe when we describe the sort of adult language, we can make sense of by tracing it ontogenetically. That to me makes a lot of sense. And the sort of range of areas of engagement, like you're able to link what a sort of Hallidayan account to an understanding of human history, I mean deep history. To me is also very, very interesting. Of course, I've always been fascinated by typology, and again, it seems to me that sort of the Hallidayan account is very inspirational in terms of typology. One can explore, one can understand, and so on. So lots of considerations that are typically not part of the discussion when you sort of say, Cardiff better or versus Sydney grammar. So all these things that are part of my sort of considerations, I think. And then I think there is value in sort of saying, okay, there aren't many folks like Michael Halliday who've, adopted these weird conceptions. Why not give them some space? Why not explore them? I think that's, worth the effort. And it seems to me that there has been payoff enough. I mean, you don't sort of, we learn from the sort of philosophy of argument, you don't take somebody on authority, but it's a sort of heuristic of trying to explore, trying to expand, trying to take in more territory and so on.